Welcome to the newest episode of Beyond the Fame with Jason Fraley. I'm your host, Jason Fraley, picking the brains of the top filmmakers, musicians, and artists of our time. Get ready, tennis fans. The new John McEnroe documentary, McEnroe, premieres today on Showtime. I spoke to director Barney Douglas about what made McEnroe one of the most dominant and controversial figures in the history of sports. Hey, Barney Douglas. Hey, thanks so much for joining us on WTOP in Washington, D.C.
Pleasure, Jason. Thanks for having me.
We're here talking your new movie. You're directing the documentary McEnroe, all about tennis legend John McEnroe. It's going to premiere on Showtime, I believe, September 2nd. So I just watched it last night. It flew by for me. I thoroughly enjoyed it. What sparked it for you? Were you always a big tennis fan, or what gave you the itch to make this now?
I mean, good question. Not new tennis, obviously knew the sport. Not a massive fan. Was aware of McEnroe's latter days, and obviously him being a very angry man in the sort of my distant memories. But the opportunity came that John was looking to make a film, so I went and met him, and obviously started digging into his life and really thinking, God, this guy is fascinating. And one of the greats, and that's kind of been forgotten and washed over by obviously some of his antics. So I thought, well, there's a lot to dig into here as a filmmaker. And what I really love is, the humanity of a story and really trying to show the spirit of McEnroe and answer some of the questions that I guess that people have asked throughout his career. So it seemed like too good an opportunity to turn down. And it's been, a really revealing journey, I think.
Awesome. Well, let's try to, there's so much covered in the documentary, but let's try to move chronologically as much as we can. So let's talk about him growing up. I love the little story in there. It's very telling of his personality and his drive and everything, his perfectionism. But remind our audiences the story about him, not being satisfied with his report card.
His wife Patty tells the story early on about him being 6 and getting an A-, and he just couldn't handle it. He was just so upset that he hadn't managed to get absolute top marks. And at 6 years old, that obviously betrays this inner drive and this sort of lack of being accepting of any kind of failure. He obviously saw success as the only means, I think, and this is going to sound quite deep, but I think the only means to really accessing kind of love and affection. He felt like success, I think, was key to that. And that obviously unfolds throughout the story of the film. But it is so revealing early on that in his childhood, enjoyment was second best to achievement.
That's a good point you made about success, and in this case through tennis, is his only access point to love, affection. I mean, you could say fame, fortune, all that, but love and affection is probably the deeper thing tied up in that ball. Well, speaking of sort of that, I mean, that's a good segue. Growing up, he even says he didn't think tennis was that cool. He started playing a little, down the street or whatever on the courts, but talk about how that whole concept changed when it did suddenly become cool. It did become in vogue. In the 70s, this explosion of pop culture acceptance of tennis is this famous thing to do. Talk about how that was the allure that sort of pulled him in.
Absolutely. And I think he got sucked in by characters. He got sucked in by the Connors and the Bjorn Borgs of this world. He was seeing this beautiful, as he calls him, like a Greek god, even though obviously he was Swedish, and girls just chasing after him and screaming after him like he was a member of the Beatles or something. And obviously this caught a young John's eye, without doubt. But he also just had this natural ability to play tennis as well. I think the way that John's brain worked, he could mathematically break up the court and start to play percentages. So it suited his mentality as well. But suddenly he was seeing that it was also pretty cool. Yeah, the girls came along with it, and the glory and the adulation, and that certainly sparked his interest, and it went on from there.
Oh yeah, definitely. And you're talking about McEnroe and Borg and Jimmy Connors, and how do you say the other one? How do you say
Vitas Gerulaitis?
Vitas Gerulaitis. They're like the four kings of tennis, and because I just did a Four Kings interview like a year ago for Showtime, they did a great thing about boxing with Leonard Hagler Hearns and Durant. So I kind of got similar vibes with this. I mean, obviously it's mostly about McEnroe, obviously, but talk about how sort of those four personalities really pushed each other to be better on the court, hung out even off the court, and and ultimately when Borg leaves, McEnroe almost feels betrayed. Like, hey, we're on this ride together. What's up?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that certainly that culturally the sport had characters then. It was kind of this cusp of not going from amateur to professional, but there was this, you'd drink after and you'd go out and you'd party hard and you could swear on the court and you could get in contact with the crowd. And there was all this kind of vibrancy to the sport that I think John still misses quite a lot. So McEnroe, I think, is perceived as this guy that came in and just, started being ill-disciplined and yelling and screaming, but it was going on before John arrived. Like he may have taken it up a notch or two, but it was absolutely going on. Nastase was there and all this kind of stuff. So he kind of got in amongst this crowd, and it just brought the sport to life. It connected with people, and I think that's what John always has been searching for his whole life: connection. And you mentioned Borg retiring and walking off court, never to be seen again, essentially. I think there's a love story there between John and Borg, and he does feel betrayed. He feels bereft when Borg walks away because it gave him this connection. It gave him this thing that he'd been searching for since being 6 years old.
Oh yeah, and their matches that we see together, it's art. It's them pushing each other in competition. And then when Borg leaves it, what was he, like 26 or something?
20, like that? 25, 26. 25, 26. So young.
He's like, well, I lost my dance partner,
So much. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned a few seconds ago, I want to unpack it a little more about how his brain sort of saw the tennis court, almost like a chessboard. And you really brilliantly, use sort of visual graphics to show, even like the grid of the percentages of, if I hit it at this little small spot, I have this 90% or whatever of winning the match. And even his wife, she sort of mentions that, maybe he was a little bit on the spectrum, or who knows, but the idea that he sees the court in a different way. Talk about how you, as a filmmaker, as a director, say we're going to visually try to capture that.
Well, it is really challenging, because if you don't know a sport, but you want to make it, accessible, I guess, to try and visualize that is really key. And I think for me, John's brain was the way in. As you mentioned, Patty mentioned that she thinks he's probably neurodivergent. I think when you put all the pieces together, I think it's pretty clear. Like he has this incredible ability to assess situations mathematically very quickly, but he finds emotional connection difficult. So we sort of lent into that with the kind of Tron-esque 80s graphics, and just tried to show and break down how John would analyze the court and not see it as like an actually emotional reaction. It was actually very, very mathematical, and it made sense to him. And I think that starts to tell you something about when he felt that something is out or not out, and the umpires make these mistakes and they're a bit blind in England and all this kind of stuff. You can see why it tapped into his frustrations, because he mathematically knew the percentages. So it really drove him crazy. And I think also not being listened to was another trigger for him as well. So yeah, trying to visualize that as a filmmaker was a lot of fun, actually. And I hope it communicates it in the way that we try to do.
Oh, you totally do. So like you use your toolkit visually and audioly, to show sort of both sides of that coin. So you show the digital grid, to speak to, on the positive side of that coin. You show how he's this like almost instantaneous split-second mathematical genius. But then on the downside, you sort of use the sound design to show almost how it could overwhelm him, distract him. He's so highly attuned that you show, with the sound design, you show him here, he picks up every sound, like what is it? There's that brilliant part where it's like he's hearing crackling of like the TV radio airwaves. He's hearing every slurping of the soda cups in the stands or whatever. Like, talk about how that was sort of, you're trying to show both sides of that,
Absolutely. And there's strengths and weaknesses to these magical powers,
these superpowers.
Yeah, they really are. And I think those are the challenges John's faced, and that's why people always found it hard to understand his decision making in these moments, because it's not driven from like a calculated decision. He's reacting to stimulus. And I kind of feel like that, to me, also as a filmmaker, even in documentary, like all these elements, the sound design, I'm really pleased you mentioned that, because there's such powerful tools that you can use to create an experience and try and let an audience know how John was feeling and try and immerse them in that scenario. Film is entertainment, and it's about communicating stories. So using all those different tools is absolutely, for me, like a lot of the fun in making a film, trying to make somebody feel how John felt and understand him, therefore, and feel empathy for him rather than just anger all the time.
Right, exactly. And I mean, you mentioned it a few seconds ago, but these gifts can be really frustrating to him. And he's really well known for all these outbursts and meltdowns and yelling at the judges, like, you cannot be serious, all that stuff, slamming his rackets. But to your point, he's seeing it almost like he sees it in his brain that what we can see in the replays, that the chalk did fly. And so like he's actually seeing it, and he can't believe that these little stupid judges don't see what he's seeing.
So
But
true.
talk about how he became like a pop culture figure for these meltdowns. Do you think that sort of overshadowed some of his brilliance, like being able to take a ball that's going so fast and just put a little bit of spin on it and just like dies? We see it in the documentary. Just die. Talk about the contrast between the meltdowns, which is his public persona, versus he's really a master at what he does.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I didn't know how good he was going into this film. It took me by surprise what a truly great Magic player that John was, and that has been overshadowed by his outbursts. And some of that, is a lot of it is his own making. And I think what communicates when you say about becoming like a kind of pop culture icon and rock stars wanting to hang out with him, all this sort of stuff, it's authenticity. That's what rock and roll is meant to be. It's like meant to be truth and good for good or bad. It's someone being themselves and being authentic. And I think that's exactly what John is. And that's why I think he retains his appeal. Sometimes it drives people crazy. Sometimes it resonates with them. But I think what people really appreciate is sort of behavior that is authentic and not Machiavellian. He doesn't try and make you like him. He doesn't try and do all these different things. He just is who he is. And I think that's why he appealed to so many rock and rollers at the time, and even now endures.
Yeah, and I think it was, speaking of rock and rollers, I think it was really cool that you got Keith Richards to sit down for an interview. That's a fresh interview, right? That's not.
No, that's completely new. Like we had very little time. We like I literally just dove in there and grabbed a few words from Keith. But it shows, as you say, the resonance that he had at that period of time, the sort of early mid-80s. Meatloaf pops up and Santana gets him on stage to play guitar with him and all this kind of stuff.
Well, and of course, Billie Jean King, that's probably the biggest get for you in terms of, sit down interviews, other than McEnroe himself. But, Billie Jean King is a legend. Talk about what it was like interviewing Billie Jean King.
Absolutely. Like Billie Jean was just an absolute joy. She's a poet. She's kind of a force of personality. She's a force of nature. She's an icon. And I think she brings so much like lyrical feeling to the film. John is a very literal person. And I think sort of drawing out those descriptions is harder with John. So but Billie Jean King gave us that description of tennis as being, an art form. And, like
the theater, she said.
The theater, exactly. And she just brings this understanding of John as well. Like that was one of the things that we were really keen, is to have a small circle of people that knew him intimately to talk about him, rather than perhaps, journalists who'd met him once or twice saying what they thought he was like. We wanted people that knew him. We wanted to be very personal. And Billie Jean brings so much of that to the film.
Definitely. And I know we're short on time, but I guess talking about interviewing people that knew him, I mean, no one knows him better than his own family, and you get some sit downs with them too. I was struck by, the tricky relationship with his father. He's like a mentor to him for the longest time. You always see him in the stands during all these big victories, but then later when he sits down to interview him, he's like, no, by the way, did you say that I'm McEnroe senior? I'm not a senior. He's a junior, but I'm just me. I'm not a senior. Like it seems like a lot of tension there with him and well, love for sure. But, a lot, like you can tell that the dad did a number on him.
Yeah, well, I think that's the kind of the heart of the film in a way. For me, it's John trying to find connection with his own father that wasn't just about success, wasn't just about achieving in sport. And then trying to have that relationship with his own kids and not make the same mistakes and have the same disconnections. And that's something he's still working on, but I think he has learned. And I think for me, that's the last half hour of the film. It's really about like that kind of resolving grief or unresolved grief, I should say, and then trying not to make the same mistakes as the father type things. There's a real like kind of generational sort of trauma that he's trying to make sure doesn't carry on. And I think that takes it beyond the normal sports biopic into something a little bit more personal, for sure.
That's such a good point, because when you're interviewing the kids and they tell that story, they're the kids of him and Tatum O'Neal is first.
Yeah.
the great story about there's this priceless, like, what do you call, what's the
Andy,
word I'm
the
looking for?
Andy
The Andy Warhol
Warhol.
painting.
Yeah.
Lucrative painting, and he just draws a mustache on it because mom and dad are fighting. But we get out of the turmoil and we see, him remarried, and you interview his current wife, and he seems to have found, happiness, at least, comparatively.
Yeah,
Right?
I think he's found acceptance.
Acceptance.
I think someone like John is never going to be at peace. And as he says, he's not sure he'd even want to be.
Right.
I think that's what keeps this fire burning in him. But he wants to be himself, and he wants to be accepted, and he wants to feel that connection and feel that it's genuine. And I think with Patty, his second wife, he found that. And, he's working on keeping that with his kids as well. And I think that, that's what life is, isn't it? It's messy and it's not quite perfect, and it has these continuous little ups and downs and peaks and troughs. And I think that's what I really love about the end. It's not like a neat bow, but it feels like he's moved on. He's got somewhere.
Exactly. Well, we appreciate your time. I guess final question, like, when it's all said and done, when the history of McEnroe is written, the takeaway here, how many titles did he ultimately win? What's the legacy, the final stats that are going to be hard to top, kind of a takeaway?
John McEnroe won 155 combined titles. So that's majors, doubles, singles, all that kind of stuff, which is still to this day the most of any tennis player, which makes you realize actually where he stands in the pantheon of the greats.
Yeah. Absolutely. But in terms of the non-stats tennis stuff, what's the takeaway from the film? Is it this journey of acceptance, the perfectionism that never rests? What is it?
Yeah, I think, the search for perfectionism is a curse, and to never be satisfied means that you probably never find peace.
Yeah.
And some people need that to drive it on. I think really the big lesson for me is that, what really matters is connection, and how you find that. I think it's got to be between two hearts, not between what you do. It's what you are, I think, more importantly.
Right. Exactly. Well, I thought it was a riveting documentary. So thanks so much. Thanks for making it, and for chatting with us. Again, everyone, this is Barney Douglas, the director of the documentary McEnroe. It's going to premiere on Showtime on September 2nd. So set your DVRs now. Hey, thanks so much.
Pleasure, man. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for listening to Beyond the Fame with Jason Fraley. Our theme music is Scott Buckley's Clarion. Remember to give us a 5-star rating if you like what you hear. We'll see you next time. I wanted to take a second to tell you about an app I really enjoy. Living in the DC area is great, and Podcast DC gathers all of the local shows that I like all in one local app. Health, sports, local news, politics, and so much more. Podcast DC is the new local app with hundreds of DC area podcasts to choose from. I can earn exciting rewards just for listening and share the podcasts I love instantly. Available in the App Store or in Google Play, listen local with Podcast DC.